For the first 20 years of the 20th century, one man ruled baseball with an iron fist. His name was Ty Cobb. He was the most feared, most hated, and most dominant player the sport had ever seen. He hit a 366 batting average for his career, the highest batting average in history. He won 12 batting titles. He stole nearly 900 bases. He held 90 records when he retired. Nobody could humble him. Nobody could make Ty Cobb feel small. Then a fat kid from Baltimore showed up and changed everything. His name was Babe Ruth, and he did not just beat Ty Cobb. He made Ty Cobb irrelevant. He took the game Cobb had mastered and threw it in the trash. He replaced science with spectacle, strategy with raw power, and singles with home runs that sailed over fences and into the streets. Cobb spent the rest of his life trying to prove that his way was better. He never succeeded, and when he died in 1961, the contrast told the whole story. Babe Ruth's funeral had drawn hundreds of thousands. Ty Cobb's drew 3 baseball men and a quiet ceremony in a small Georgia town. This is not just the story of 2 baseball players. This is the story of 2 philosophies of baseball, 2 ways of seeing the world, and the moment when one was replaced by the other forever. This is the story of the day Ty Cobb was finally humbled. To understand what Babe Ruth took from Ty Cobb, you first have to understand what Cobb had built. Tyrus Raymond Cobb was born on December 18, 1886, in Narrows, Georgia. His father, William Herschel Cobb, was a schoolteacher, a state senator, and one of the most respected men in the county. The Cobbs were Southern aristocracy. They traced their lineage to the Civil War, where ancestors had led cavalry units in General Lee's army. William Cobb expected greatness from his son. When young Ty told his father he wanted to play professional baseball, his father was horrified. Baseball was a game for ruffians and drunkards. But Ty was determined, and his father eventually relented with a warning that would define his son's entire life: do not come home a failure. 3 weeks before Ty made the major leagues in 1905, his mother shot and killed his father. She claimed she had mistaken him for a burglar. The community whispered about an affair. A trial followed. She was acquitted. Ty Cobb arrived in the major leagues, carrying grief, rage, and a desperate need to prove himself. He channeled all of it into baseball. From the moment Cobb stepped onto a major league field, he played the game like a man possessed. Baseball in the dead ball era was a war of inches. The ball was dead, wound loosely, and often waterlogged. Home runs were rare because the ball simply did not travel far enough. A typical team might hit 20 home runs in an entire season. The game was won through bunts, stolen bases, hit-and-run plays, sacrifices, and psychological warfare. It was a game of strategy and intimidation, and Ty Cobb was the master of both. Cobb mastered every weapon in the dead ball arsenal. He choked up on his bat, spread his hands apart on the handle, and slapped the ball wherever the defense was not. He could bunt for a hit, drive the ball into the gaps, or push a single through the infield with surgical precision. He studied pitchers obsessively, memorizing their patterns, their tells, their weaknesses. Every at-bat was a chess match, and Cobb was always 3 moves ahead. He hit over 300 every single year, from 1906 through 1928. 23 consecutive seasons above 300. He won the batting title in 1907, his first, and kept winning it almost every year through 1919. In 1911, he hit .420, one of the highest averages of the modern era. In 1912, he hit .410. These were not flukes. This was sustained, relentless dominance, the likes of which baseball had never seen. On the base paths, he was a terror. He sharpened his spikes and slid into bases with his feet high, daring fielders to hold their ground. Most did not. Second basemen and shortstops learned to get out of the way when Cobb was running. He stole home 54 times in his career, a record that still stands more than a century later. He once stole second, third, and home in the same inning just to prove he could. He stole 892 bases in his career, a record that stood for nearly 50 years until Lou Brock broke it in 1977. His teammates feared him. His opponents despised him. He fought umpires, fans, and his own players with equal enthusiasm. In 1912, he climbed into the stands at Hilltop Park in New York and attacked a heckler named Claude Lucker, beating the man with his fists even after learning that Lucker had lost most of his fingers in an industrial accident. When bystanders shouted at him to stop because the man was crippled, Cobb replied, "I do not care if he has no feet." He was suspended by American League President Ban Johnson. His entire Tigers team went on strike in protest, refusing to play until Cobb was reinstated. Johnson refused to budge. The Tigers were forced to field a team of replacement players for one game. College kids and amateurs pulled off the streets of Philadelphia, who lost 24-2 against the Athletics. It remains one of the most lopsided games in baseball history. The strike lasted one game. The regular players returned after the team was threatened with massive fines. But the message was clear. That was Ty Cobb, a man so dominant that his own team would rather forfeit than play without him. A man so fierce that the entire sport bent around his will. A man who treated the baseball diamond like a battlefield and every opponent like an enemy combatant. From 1907 through 1919, Cobb won 12 of 13 batting titles. The one year he missed, 1916, he still hit .371, which would have won the title in almost any other season. He hit over 300 for 23 consecutive seasons. He led the American League in hits 7 times, in runs scored 5 times, in stolen bases 6 times, in on-base percentage 6 times, and in slugging percentage 8 times. He won the Triple Crown in 1909, leading the league in batting average, home runs, and runs batted in. He was named the most valuable player twice, in 1911 and 1912. He was not just the best hitter in baseball, he was the most complete player the sport had ever produced. He could beat you with his bat, with his legs, with his glove, with his arm, and with his brain. Nobody in the history of the game has ever combined all 5 tools with such relentless intensity. He was, by any measure, the greatest player in the history of baseball. The writers who voted for the first Hall of Fame class in 1936 confirmed it, giving Cobb more votes than any other player, including Babe Ruth, Honus Wagner, Walter Johnson, and Christy Mathewson. And then 1920 happened. George Herman Ruth was born on February 6, 1895, in Baltimore, Maryland. His childhood was the opposite of Cobb's in every way. Where Cobb came from privilege and expectation, Ruth came from poverty and neglect. His parents ran a saloon. By age 7, he was essentially abandoned, sent to St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys, a reform school and orphanage run by Catholic missionaries. At St. Mary's, a man named Brother Matthias taught Ruth how to play baseball. Matthias was a giant of a man, 6'6" and over 250 pounds, and Ruth worshipped him. He was the closest thing to a father figure Ruth ever had. Ruth was a natural, a left-handed pitcher with enormous power and an easy swing that seemed to generate force from nowhere. He was big, clumsy, loud, and joyful. He did not play baseball like it was war. He played it like it was recess. He laughed when he struck out. He whooped when he hit one far. He treated the game as entertainment, not combat. Ruth entered the major leagues in 1914 as a pitcher for the Boston Red Sox. He was brilliant on the mound, winning 89 games in 6 seasons with an earned run average of 2.28. He led Boston to 3 World Series championships in 1915, 1916, and 1918. He was one of the best left-handed pitchers in the American League. But everyone noticed something else. When Ruth swung the bat, the ball went places nobody had ever seen a baseball go. Line drives that carried over outfielders' heads. Fly balls that cleared fences by 30 or 40 feet. Shots that landed in parts of the stadium where baseballs had simply never been hit before. In 1919, Ruth hit 29 home runs, shattering the single-season record. The Red Sox, desperate for cash, sold him to the New York Yankees before the 1920 season for $100,000. What happened next changed baseball forever. In his first year as a Yankee, Babe Ruth hit 54 home runs. 54. To understand how absurd that number was, consider this. The entire St. Louis Browns roster hit 37 home runs that season. The entire Philadelphia Athletics hit 44. Babe Ruth, one man, hit more home runs than every player on those teams combined. The previous single-season record was 29, set by Ruth himself the year before. He did not inch past the record. He obliterated it, nearly doubling the number in a single season. No individual had ever done anything like this in any sport. It was as if someone had broken the rules of physics. Sports writers ran out of words to describe what they were watching. Fans who had never cared about baseball started showing up just to see this man swing a bat. Ruth did not just set a new record, he created an entirely new category of athlete: the power hitter, the slugger, the man who could end a game with one swing. He did not choke up on the bat. He gripped it at the end and swung as hard as he could every single time. He did not bunt. He did not play for one run. He did not care about strikeouts. He ignored every convention of the dead ball era. He swung for the fences, and when he connected, the ball exploded off his bat and soared over walls that had been considered unreachable. The transformation was instantaneous. Before Ruth, a typical American League game might produce 1 or 2 extra base hits. After Ruth, the entire league began to change. Other hitters saw what Ruth was doing and started swinging harder. Owners noticed that fans screamed louder for home runs than for sacrifice bunts. The ball itself was changed, wound tighter, bouncier, livelier. Umpires began replacing dirty, scuffed balls with clean white ones more frequently. The spitball was banned. Everything conspired to turn baseball into a power game. Ruth was not just hitting home runs, he was birthing an entirely new sport. The dead ball era was over. The live ball era had begun. And its founding father was a man who looked nothing like an athlete and played nothing like Ty Cobb. The fans went insane. Attendance at Yankee games skyrocketed. When the Yankees came to Detroit, Navin Field was packed to the rafters. But the fans were not coming to see Ty Cobb. They were coming to see Babe Ruth hit one over the wall. This is where the humbling began. Cobb watched all of this with growing horror. Everything he had built, everything he believed about baseball was being dismantled by a man he considered a clown. Ruth was overweight, undisciplined, and crude. He drank enormous quantities of alcohol. He ate like a man who had never seen food before. He chased women across every city in America. He was, in Cobb's eyes, everything a ballplayer should not be. And the fans loved him more than they had ever loved Ty Cobb. Yankees manager Miller Huggins captured the difference perfectly. Cobb cannot be fully appreciated unless you are a student of baseball, Huggins said. Ruth appeals to everybody. That single sentence was a dagger in Cobb's heart. Think about what Huggins was really saying. He was saying that Cobb's genius was invisible to the average fan, that you needed to understand the game at a deep level to appreciate what Cobb was doing. But Ruth needed no explanation. A ball flying over the fence was its own argument. A crowd leaping to its feet was its own justification. Cobb had spent 20 years perfecting the most scientific approach to hitting the game had ever seen. He had turned baseball into an art form, a chess match played at 90 miles per hour. And now a man who simply swung as hard as he could was more popular, more celebrated, and more important than Ty Cobb had ever been. The newspapers confirmed it. Ruth was on the front page. Cobb was on page 3. Ruth's home runs were described in breathless, poetic language. Cobb's stolen bases barely merited a mention. The world was changing, and Cobb was on the wrong side of history. Cobb abhorred Ruth's power game. He saw fans becoming enamored with the home run, and he was terrified that the inside style of bunting, taking the extra base and hitting the ball to gaps that he had perfected, would fall by the wayside. He was right, it did. Anyone can hit a home run if they try, Cobb sneered. But he did not try, not yet. The tension between Cobb and Ruth was not just philosophical, it was deeply personal. Cobb insulted Ruth constantly, mocking his appearance, his weight, and his hygiene. Ruth was known throughout the league for his body odor. One American League first baseman admitted that when Ruth reached base, he played a few extra feet off the bag just to avoid the smell. Cobb was crueler than that. He made fun of Ruth's broad nose and dark complexion. He used racial slurs, calling Ruth names that were vicious even by the standards of the 1920s. Ruth, to his credit, mostly shrugged it off. He did not take things as personally as Cobb did. He did not take anything as personally as Cobb did. In June of 1921, the Tigers and Yankees met for a 4-game series at the Polo Grounds in New York. Both teams were contending for the pennant. Cobb was the Tigers' player-manager, hitting over .400, still one of the most dangerous hitters in baseball. Ruth had already hit 17 home runs and was on pace to break his own record. Before the game on June 12th, Cobb stood near the Tigers' dugout and performed a pantomime for the crowd of 30,000 fans. He mocked Ruth's body, imitating his wide frame and exaggerated swing. He called him a gorilla. When Ruth struck out later in the game, Cobb cupped his hands around his mouth and screamed insults that could be heard across the diamond. The umpires and the Yankees manager had to intervene to prevent what one newspaper called a violent onslaught against the offending Cobb. But Cobb had poked the bear. The next day, June 13th, Ruth played what many called the grudge game of his career. He hit his 19th home run of the season, a towering shot into the right field stands. He struck out Ty Cobb in a critical at-bat. The Yankees won the game, and when it was over, Cobb and Ruth stood behind the pitcher's mound, barking at each other while teammates held them back. That was the day Cobb's batting average dropped below .400, and Babe Ruth presided over the occasion. Later that summer, the rivalry boiled over into actual violence. During a game at Navin Field in Detroit, a Tigers pitcher hit Yankees outfielder Bob Musel in the back with a pitch artech. Ruth was furious. He accused Cobb of ordering his pitcher to throw at Musel. The accusation may or may not have been true, but it did not matter. Tensions that had been simmering all season finally exploded. Players from both teams confronted each other on the field. Benches emptied. Insults flew. Then something happened that had never happened before. Thousands of Tigers fans poured out of the stands and onto the field, surrounding the Yankee players. The scene turned dangerous. Umpire Billy Evans, who had once fought Cobb himself under the grandstand after a game in 1921, found himself in the middle of the chaos. When a fan charged at him, Evans leveled the man with a roundhouse punch that knocked him to the ground. Police were dispatched to surround the Yankee bench and protect the players from the mob. Ruth and Musel were hustled away beneath the stands for their own safety. It took more than 25 minutes to restore order. By the time the fans were cleared and the ball players separated, the umpiring crew had no choice but to forfeit the game to the Yankees, who had been leading 10-6 in the 9th inning. The final inning was never completed. The Yankees won the next day's game as well, then left town. But Babe Ruth never quite left the mind of Ty Cobb. The man who had once ruled baseball with absolute authority had been reduced to ordering pitchers to throw at the man who had replaced him. By 1925, Cobb had endured 5 years of watching Ruth transform baseball into a home run contest. He was 38 years old. His Tigers had stumbled to a 4-14 start. The fans who once worshipped him now came to the ballpark to see visiting sluggers launch balls over the fence. Cobb was bitter. He was also determined to prove a point. Before a game against the St. Louis Browns on May 5th, Cobb sat in the dugout with a reporter and made an announcement. "I will show you something today," he said. "I am going for home runs for the first time in my career." Then he went out and did exactly that. Cobb went 6 for 6 against the Browns. He hit 3 home runs, all of them over the fence, not inside the park jobs that relied on speed. He also hit a double and 2 singles. He set a modern record with 16 total bases. His first homer was a 2-run shot off Bullet Joe Bush in the first inning. His second was another 2-run blast off Elam Van Gilder in the second. His third came in the 8th inning off Milt Gaston. The Tigers won 14-8. It was only the 7th 3-home run game in modern-era history. The press was stunned. The Georgia Peach, the master of the bunt and the stolen base, had just put on one of the most explosive power displays anyone had ever seen. The next day, he hit 2 more home runs. His 5th homer was his 100th career round-tripper. 5 home runs in 2 days, 9 hits in 12 at-bats, 11 runs batted in, 25 total bases. It was the most explosive 2-game hitting performance since Cap Anson in 1884. The Sporting News called him the Regal Bengal of the Tiger Lair. The point had been made. Ty Cobb could hit home runs. He could play Ruth's game if he wanted to. He had chosen not to because he believed his way was superior. But here is the thing that Cobb did not want anyone to notice. After those 2 games in St. Louis, he went right back to his old style. He did not hit another home run until June. He finished the season with 12, tying his career high. From mid-July through late August, while the Tigers went 8-16 in games he played, he did not hit a single home run. If Cobb could truly hit home runs at will, why did he stop when his team desperately needed them? Why did he go homerless for 6 weeks while the Tigers were losing? The answer, though Cobb would never admit it, was simple. He could not sustain it. He was 38 years old. He had spent his entire career training his body to slap the ball, not launch it. 2 days of home runs did not prove that Cobb could be Babe Ruth. It proved that on 2 perfect days, with the right pitchers and the right conditions, Ty Cobb could briefly imitate what Babe Ruth did every single week. That was the difference. And deep down, Cobb knew it. Cobb played 3 more seasons after the Power Show, spending his final 2 years with the Philadelphia Athletics alongside another aging legend, Tris Speaker. In his final season, 1928, Cobb was 41 years old. He hit .323. He could still hit better than most players in their prime, but the game had left him behind. He retired after the 1928 season with a .366 career batting average, the highest in history. He held 90 major league records. He had 4,189 hits, the most in history. A record that would stand for 57 years until Pete Rose broke it in 1985. He had scored 2,246 runs. He had stolen 892 bases. He had been the most feared and most dominant player of his era by a margin that may never be matched. In 1936, when the Baseball Hall of Fame held its first election, Ty Cobb received the most votes of any player. He got 222 out of 226 ballots, 98.2%. More than Babe Ruth, who received 95.1%. More than Honus Wagner. More than Walter Johnson or Christy Mathewson. He was, by the official vote of the writers who had watched them all play, the greatest player in baseball history. He had won the argument on paper. But it did not matter, because by 1936, baseball belonged to Babe Ruth. The argument had moved beyond statistics and into something larger. It was about identity. It was about what baseball meant to America. And America had chosen the home run. Ruth had retired the year before with 714 home runs, a number that seemed unreachable. He had led the Yankees to 7 pennants and 4 World Series championships. He had built Yankee Stadium, the house that Ruth built, because the old Polo Grounds could not hold the crowds that came to see him play. The stadium opened in 1923 and immediately became the most famous venue in American sports. Ruth had not just broken Cobb's records, he had made them irrelevant. Nobody cared about stolen bases anymore. Nobody cared about sacrifice bunts or hit-and-run plays or advancing runners one station at a time. The fans wanted home runs. The owners wanted home runs. The sports writers wanted home runs. The game itself had been rebuilt around the home run, and the man who had built it was Babe Ruth. Ruth's personality was as oversized as his swing. He was generous to a fault, visiting sick children in hospitals, signing autographs for hours, and giving money to strangers on the street. He was beloved not just for what he did on the field, but for who he was off it. He was fun, he was warm, he made people happy just by being in the room. Cobb made people uncomfortable, Ruth made them smile, and in the battle for baseball's soul, the smile won. Cobb spent his retirement years in Georgia, wealthy from shrewd early investments in Coca-Cola stock and General Motors, but increasingly isolated from the world. His fortune was estimated at $12 million, an enormous sum for the era. He had more money than almost any athlete in history. But money could not buy him what he truly wanted, which was to be remembered as the greatest. His first marriage ended in divorce. His second marriage ended in divorce. His relationships with his children were strained, sometimes non-existent. He drank heavily, he was suspicious of everyone. He carried a loaded Luger pistol wherever he went, convinced that someone was always trying to take something from him. He funded a hospital in his hometown of Royston, Georgia. He established the Cobb Educational Foundation, which provided college scholarships to needy students in Georgia. He donated generously to causes he believed in. These acts of charity were real, but they were rarely mentioned in the press. The public image of Ty Cobb was set. He was the villain, Ruth was the hero. Nothing could change that. In his final years, Cobb was diagnosed with diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, kidney disease, and prostate cancer. He traveled from hospital to hospital, carrying an envelope stuffed with millions of dollars in negotiable securities. When asked in the late 1950s how well he thought he could hit against modern pitchers, Cobb replied, "Probably about 270. When the interviewer expressed surprise at such a low number, Cobb said, "Well, you have to remember, I am over 70 years old." It was a rare flash of humor from a man who had very little left to laugh about. On July 17, 1961, Ty Cobb died at Emory Hospital in Atlanta. He was 74 years old. His funeral was held in Cornelia, Georgia. His family kept it private, not trusting the media to report it fairly. They turned away former players who offered to serve as pallbearers. Approximately 150 friends and relatives attended. But from all of baseball, from the sport Cobb had dominated for more than 2 decades, only 3 former players showed up: Ray Schalk, Mickey Cochran, and Nap Rucker. Sid Keener from the Hall of Fame was the only baseball official present. To be fair, much of the narrative around Cobb's lonely funeral was exaggerated by Al Stump, a writer who later fabricated much of what he wrote about Cobb's final days. Cobb's family had specifically requested a private funeral and turned away many people from baseball who offered to attend and serve as pallbearers. The Sporting News reported that the family did not want Cobb's funeral to become a circus the way Ruth's had, and Cobb had simply outlived most of his contemporaries. Walter Johnson died in 1946, Tris Speaker died in 1958, Connie Mack died in 1956, and Babe Ruth had died in 1948. But when Ruth died, the contrast was still devastating, regardless of context. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets outside Yankee Stadium and St. Patrick's Cathedral to pay their respects. The entire country mourned. Newspapers ran front-page tributes. Ruth's funeral was one of the largest public gatherings New York City had ever seen. It was a national event, the farewell to a man who had transcended baseball and become an American icon. 13 years later, Ty Cobb was buried in a family mausoleum in Royston, Georgia. Uniformed Little League players lined the road in the cemetery. About 400 people gathered to watch the casket carried inside. He had left a quarter of his $12 million estate to the Cobb Educational Foundation, ensuring that Georgia students would receive scholarships for generations to come. It was a quiet, dignified farewell. But it was not the farewell of the greatest player who ever lived. It was the farewell of a man the world had moved past. That is the tragedy of Ty Cobb. He was not wrong about baseball. His way of playing the game required more skill, more intelligence, more discipline, and more courage than anything Babe Ruth ever did. Slapping a ball through the infield while running full speed is harder than swinging for the fences and hoping for the best. Stealing home requires more nerve than hitting a home run ever will. But baseball is not a debate club. It is entertainment, and the fans did not want to watch a chess match. They wanted to see a ball fly over the fence. Babe Ruth gave them what they wanted. Ty Cobb gave them what he thought they needed. The fans chose Ruth, and baseball followed. Cobb hit .366. Ruth changed the world. Cobb won 12 batting titles. Ruth built Yankee Stadium. Cobb received the most votes in the first Hall of Fame class. Ruth's funeral drew hundreds of thousands. Cobb played the game the right way. Ruth played the game in a way that made people fall in love with it. In the end, Ty Cobb was the greatest player of a game that no longer existed. He had mastered an art form that the world had decided it no longer wanted. He spent his final decades watching home runs sail over fences, watching fans cheer for sluggers who could not bunt, could not steal, could not play the inside game that Cobb had perfected. And every home run was a reminder that the world had chosen Babe Ruth. Cobb once said, "The base paths belong to me. The rules of the game were written for me." And for 20 years, that was true. The base paths did belong to him. The rules were written for his style of play. Then Babe Ruth showed up and rewrote the rules entirely. Ty Cobb was never humbled by a pitcher. He was never humbled by a fielder. He was never humbled by an opponent who played the game the way he played it. But he was humbled by a fat kid from Baltimore who did not play the game at all, who played something else entirely. Something louder, bigger, and more exciting. Something that made 50,000 people stand on their feet and scream. Something that made Ty Cobb's .366 disappear in the shadow of a ball sailing over the right field wall. Ty Cobb was the greatest hitter who ever lived. Babe Ruth was the most important player who ever lived. And that was the one thing Ty Cobb could never accept. Like and subscribe for more baseball documentaries. Until next time.